Before dawn on Monday, August 13, 2018, a quiet cul-de-sac in Frederick, Colorado became the stage for a disappearance that looked, at first glance, like a domestic mystery, and within days, hardened into one of the most infamous American family crime cases of the 21st century. A young mother, Shanann Watts, vanished along with her two small daughters, Bella and Celeste, from a home that still held their shoes, their routines, the ordinary clutter of a life that should have continued into morning. The man at the center of the story, Chris Watts, presented himself as the anxious husband and father, a normal suburban figure framed by a driveway, a front door, and a camera-friendly narrative of concern. That image would not survive the week. The reason this case detonated across the country was not only the brutality of what happened, but the speed with which the facade collapsed under the weight of small details, digital traces, and the pressure of attention. In a modern suburban crime, time is measured in phone pings, doorbell footage, credit card activity, social posts, security cameras, GPS points. The Watts case unfolded in a way that made the audience feel like it was watching the architecture of a double life come apart in real time. The public did not merely learn the facts. It watched the gap widen between what a man tried to look like and what his actions had already made inevitable. Shanann had returned from a work trip to Arizona late the night before, in the early hours of August 13. The next morning, when she failed to respond and missed scheduled obligations, concern arrived quickly, then escalated. Very early in the timeline, people close to her behavior and habits noticed that something was not aligning. The disappearance was not treated like an abstract possibility. It felt immediate. It felt wrong. And in cases like this, wrongness is often the first true clue, the first signal that the story being offered is already being arranged. Chris Watts, when he became the visible face of the situation, offered a version of events that tried to keep the world calm. He suggested she might have left, perhaps upset, perhaps needing space, perhaps taking the children with her. In isolation, those explanations can sound plausible. In context, they begin to fail. A mother leaving behind essentials, a missing phone, a missing car, no confirmed sightings, no financial activity consistent with travel or starting over. Each absence becomes a problem. Each gap in the narrative becomes a place where truth can seep through. The investigation's early momentum came from something deceptively simple. The disappearance did not behave like a voluntary departure. It behaved like a sudden stop. And when a life stops suddenly, investigators do not only ask where a person went. They ask what could have happened inside the last known environment, what pressure could have been present, what conflict might have existed behind closed doors, what private changes were underway that the public version of the marriage did not reveal. As the case accelerated, the image of the Watts family that had been visible online became part of the evidence of contrast. Photos and videos showed smiles, birthdays, a neatly constructed narrative of family warmth. But family images are not proof of family stability. They are proof that a camera was present. A home can look peaceful from the outside and still contain the quiet, grinding stress of resentment, debt, secrecy, and shifting attachment. In the Watts case, that private stress would soon become central, because investigators began to see a marriage under strain and a husband whose emotional life had moved somewhere else. A key element in how the story turned so fast was how quickly the missing family framing collided with practical realities. Surveillance footage in the neighborhood, particularly from a neighbor's camera, captured activity around the Watts home in the pre-dawn hours that drew attention. In suburban investigations, cameras do not have to show violence to be valuable. Sometimes they only show movement, a vehicle, a shadow, a pattern that does not match routine. The significance is not always in what you can clearly see, but in what the movement implies when placed against a timeline. From the beginning, law enforcement did what modern investigations do. They built a timeline dense enough to withstand emotion. They mapped last known contacts. They examined phone data. They looked at vehicle movements. They considered the social world around Shanann. They examined the internal dynamics of the home. They also examined Chris, not just as a worried spouse, but as a person whose statements would need to remain consistent as facts accumulated. In cases like this, consistency becomes a test. A person who is telling the truth can still be confused, still be panicked, still be imperfect. But fabricated narratives tend to fracture under repetition because they have to be actively managed. The case's public intensity rose sharply when Chris appeared in media appeals. In a situation where the family is missing, the husband's role is expected to be urgent, raw, uncontrolled. Yet what many observers perceived was an effect that felt measured, contained, oddly clean at the edges. Perception is not evidence on its own, but perception becomes relevant when evidence starts to align with it, when the emotional presentation seems to be working too hard to remain in the right shape. This is part of what made the story so consuming, the sense that the worried husband persona was a costume that did not fit perfectly. Behind the public story, investigators were dealing with more than a missing person case. They were dealing with a marriage that had documented tension and a husband who had begun a relationship outside the marriage. In family annihilation cases, an affair is not automatically a cause, but it can be a catalyst, a sign of emotional relocation, a sign that a person has begun to mentally exit their current life while still living inside it. The public tends to imagine crimes as explosions of rage. Many of the most chilling cases are not explosions. They are decisions. The shift from missing to homicide is always a crossing of a line, and in this case it came quickly. Evidence, pressure, and inconsistencies converged. Chris Watts ultimately admitted to killing Shanann and later provided accounts indicating responsibility for the deaths of his daughters as well. The confirmed outcome of the case is devastating in its clarity. Shanann and the children were killed, and Chris Watts was convicted. The fine details of the timeline and the exact sequence of actions were central to prosecution and public understanding. But the larger story, the one that made the case echo, was the transformation of a suburban father into a person capable of extinguishing the lives he was supposed to protect. When the legal process concluded, the case did not end in the culture. It lingered because it contained the elements that haunt modern audiences: the banality of the setting, the ordinariness of the family imagery, the short window between normalcy and catastrophe, the role of digital evidence, and the terror of realizing that you can live beside a person for years and still not know what they are capable of when they decide to rewrite their life by force. If you want this as a 100,000+ character YouTube narration script in the same dark, cinematic voice, I will continue from here, expanding into the marriage strain, the financial and relational pressures, the week-by-week unraveling, the surveillance timeline, the investigative squeeze, and the courtroom resolution. All in narrator-only prose with big paragraphs and no dialogue. As the investigation deepened, the image of the Watts household began to separate into two parallel realities. One was public and polished, constructed through social media posts, videos, and photographs that showed birthdays, holidays, smiling children, and a mother who documented her life with relentless optimism. The other was private and increasingly unstable, marked by financial pressure, emotional withdrawal, and a growing sense that the life being performed for the outside world no longer matched what was unfolding behind closed doors. This split reality is critical to understanding why the case struck such a nerve. It was not simply about violence. It was about the collapse of a carefully maintained identity and the speed with which that collapse turned lethal. Financial strain played a quiet but persistent role. The family faced mounting debt, missed payments, and the looming possibility of losing the home that symbolized their stability. Financial stress does not cause murder, but it can act as a constant background noise, eroding patience and narrowing a person's perceived options. For Chris Watts, money problems existed alongside something far more destabilizing: the emotional disengagement from his family and the redirection of his attention toward a new relationship. This shift did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, invisibly, in text messages, secret meetings, and the internal rationalizations of a man who had begun to imagine a different future without the obligations of the one he was already living. Affairs in true crime are often misunderstood. They are not always about passion. Sometimes they are about escape. They offer a fantasy of simplicity, a place where responsibilities feel suspended and consequences seem distant. In the Watts case, the affair represented a psychological exit ramp. Chris did not simply want something new. He wanted his existing life to stop existing. The children, the marriage, the debts, the expectations, the version of himself that had been shaped by family responsibility all became obstacles in a narrative he was rewriting in his own mind. As investigators examined phone records, messages, and behavior patterns, the contrast between Chris's internal life and his external performance became harder to ignore. His communication with his wife in the weeks leading up to the murders showed emotional withdrawal, detachment, and a refusal to engage in conflict resolution. This emotional absence mattered. In many domestic homicide cases, the critical warning sign is not escalating arguments, but silence. Silence suggests a person has already disengaged emotionally, that they are no longer trying to fix what is broken because they have already decided it will not be fixed. The morning of August 13 became the focal point where all these hidden dynamics converged. Investigators reconstructed that morning minute by minute, not because every second held a dramatic revelation, but because the truth in such cases often lies in the ordinary transitions between moments. A vehicle starting earlier than usual. A departure time that does not match routine. A phone that stops moving. A house that goes still. When these small deviations are layered together, they form a pattern that resists coincidence. One of the most haunting elements of the case was how little outward chaos accompanied the violence. There was no sign of a struggle that spilled into public view. No neighbors reported screams. No visible damage to the home. This absence reinforced a disturbing reality. Some crimes are carried out quietly, efficiently, by people who have already decided that resistance, emotion, and hesitation are inconveniences. The lack of disorder did not suggest peace. It suggested control. As evidence accumulated, Chris Watts found himself under increasing pressure. Investigators confronted him with inconsistencies, data points that contradicted his statements, and timelines that no longer bent to his explanations. In these moments, the psychological burden of maintaining a false narrative becomes immense. Lies must be remembered, details must align, emotions must be performed convincingly. And eventually, the strain exposes cracks. Chris's accounts shifted. His explanations changed shape. Each adjustment revealed not cleverness, but desperation. The moment when a suspect transitions from denial to confession is often misunderstood by the public as a sudden collapse of conscience. In reality, it is more often a strategic surrender to inevitability. When the walls close in and the narrative can no longer be sustained, confession becomes a way to regain a sense of control, to choose the terms under which the truth emerges. In the Watts case, the admissions confirmed what the evidence had already begun to make undeniable. Shanann and her daughters had not disappeared. They had been killed by the person closest to them. The recovery of the victims' bodies transformed the case from a mystery into a reckoning. The locations, the manner, and the context of their deaths intensified public outrage and horror. The contrast between the innocence of the children and the calculated nature of the crime shattered any remaining illusions. This was no crime of sudden rage. It was a crime of decision, of forethought, of a man who prioritized the erasure of his responsibilities over the lives of his family. Court proceedings stripped away the final layers of ambiguity. Chris Watts pled guilty, sparing the families a prolonged trial, but offering no relief from the devastation. The legal resolution was swift, but the emotional and cultural impact was not. The case entered the collective consciousness as a symbol of a particular kind of modern horror, the danger hidden within normalcy, the threat posed by people who look indistinguishable from everyone else. What unsettled audiences most was not just what Chris Watts did, but how comprehensible his surface life appeared before the crimes. He did not fit the popular stereotype of a monster. He fit the stereotype of a neighbor. And that realization forces an uncomfortable confrontation with reality. Evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it blends in, smiles for photos, participates in routines, and waits for a moment when it decides that other people's lives are negotiable. The Watts case continues to be analyzed because it raises questions that have no comforting answers. How well can we truly know the people we share our lives with? How many private decisions are invisible until they manifest as irreversible acts? How easily a person can mentally detach from moral constraints once they convince themselves that their future matters more than anyone else's present. For true crime audiences, the case offers a grim lesson in patterns. The slow emotional withdrawal, the secret redirection of intimacy, the mounting pressure of finances and expectation, the careful construction of a public persona. None of these elements alone predicts violence. Together, in rare and catastrophic circumstances, they form a pathway toward it. The story does not end with a sentence handed down in court. It persists in the families left behind, in the cultural conversations about domestic violence and coercive control, and in the uneasy awareness that safety is not guaranteed by appearances. The Watts case remains a reminder that the most dangerous fractures are often silent, developing not in moments of chaos, but in long stretches of quiet where decisions are made without witnesses. Even after the legal outcome was finalized, the Watts case refused to settle into the past. It lingered because it exposed something deeply uncomfortable about how modern families are understood and how violence can incubate behind the most carefully curated images. The story did not feel distant or exotic. It felt familiar. It unfolded in a subdivision that could have existed anywhere, among routines that mirrored millions of others, inside a home that had been photographed, shared, and liked by people who saw nothing alarming at all. That familiarity made the crime resonate long after the facts were known, because it suggested that the warning signs were not dramatic or cinematic, but subtle, internal, and easily dismissed until it was too late. One of the most disturbing elements was the speed with which Chris Watts appeared to emotionally reframe his family from loved ones into obstacles. This psychological shift did not announce itself loudly. It happened quietly, through disengagement, through avoidance, through the slow replacement of empathy with self-interest. In the weeks leading up to the murders, his language toward Shanann grew distant and transactional. The warmth drained out. The connection thinned. What remained was obligation without attachment, and obligation without attachment is a fragile thing. When a person stops seeing others as fully real, fully human participants in their own future, the moral barriers that protect life begin to erode. The children, in particular, became symbols of the crime's incomprehensibility. They represented innocence, dependency, and trust, qualities that should function as absolute deterrents to harm. Yet in this case, those deterrents failed. This is why the Watts case is often discussed in the context of family annihilation, a category of crime that challenges the most basic assumptions about parental instinct. These cases force society to confront the reality that the capacity for violence is not always external or alien. Sometimes it grows within roles that are culturally idealized and rarely questioned. Digital evidence played a crucial role in shaping both the investigation and the public's understanding of the crime. Phone records, location data, and surveillance footage created a kind of unblinking memory that contradicted human storytelling. Where Chris attempted to narrate innocence, data narrated movement. Where he suggested uncertainty, timestamps suggested precision. In modern true crime, technology often becomes the most reliable witness, not because it understands motive, but because it does not forget. The Watts case demonstrated how difficult it has become to erase reality when reality leaves traces everywhere. Public fascination with the case also revealed something about collective psychology. People did not only want to know what happened, they wanted to know how it could have happened without anyone stopping it. They replayed videos of Chris's media appearances, analyzed facial expressions, scrutinized tone and posture, searching for the moment where guilt might leak through. This retrospective scrutiny is understandable, but it carries a risk. It can create the illusion that such crimes are detectable in advance through surface behavior alone, when in reality, many perpetrators are adept at performing normalcy until the moment they act. The role of social media in the Watts case added another layer of complexity. Shanann's online presence documented a life filled with affirmations, family moments, and public positivity. After her death, that same documentation became a haunting archive, a record of intention and hope that ended abruptly. For viewers, scrolling backward through her posts felt like watching time reverse toward an unavoidable end. The contrast between what was planned and what occurred amplified the tragedy, turning ordinary digital memories into artifacts of loss. In the aftermath, discussions around the case often returned to questions of control and entitlement. Chris Watts did not act in a moment of uncontrollable rage. He acted to regain control over a narrative he felt was slipping away. His family represented commitments he no longer wanted, and rather than confronting those commitments through separation, accountability, or conflict, he chose eradication. This decision reflects a dangerous mindset in which other people's lives are treated as variables rather than absolutes, as problems to be solved rather than realities to be respected. The legal system dealt with Chris Watts decisively, but the broader implications of the case remain unresolved. It continues to be cited in conversations about domestic violence, emotional abuse, and the warning signs of coercive control. It challenges the idea that danger always looks dangerous. It underscores how quickly private dissatisfaction can metastasize when paired with secrecy, resentment, and a lack of internal restraint. For audiences, the Watts case functions as both a narrative and a warning. It tells a story of deception, violence, and irreversible loss, but it also invites uncomfortable self-examination. It asks how much of what we believe about others is based on performance rather than truth. It asks whether we are equipped to recognize emotional withdrawal as a serious signal rather than a temporary phase. It asks whether society places too much faith in appearances and not enough attention on patterns of disengagement. The enduring power of the case lies in its ordinariness. There were no exotic settings, no criminal masterminds, no chaotic chases. There was a house, a family, a decision made in private, and consequences that rippled outward with devastating force. That simplicity makes the story difficult to dismiss and impossible to forget. It reminds us that the most catastrophic endings often begin not with noise, but with silence, with a person quietly deciding that their future matters more than anyone else's life. As time passed, the Watts case began to function less like a single criminal event and more like a mirror held up to modern domestic life. Analysts, commentators, and ordinary viewers returned to the same question again and again, not because the answer changed, but because it remained so difficult to accept. How does a person cross the line from dissatisfaction to annihilation? The temptation is to search for a dramatic trigger, a singular breaking point that explains everything. The reality, suggested by the evidence and by similar cases, is far more unsettling. The path is usually incremental, a slow narrowing of empathy, a gradual replacement of shared identity with private fantasy, a series of internal permissions granted one by one until the unthinkable no longer feels impossible. In the weeks before the murders, Chris Watts did not appear outwardly unstable. He went to work. He communicated politely. He maintained the routines expected of him. This outward normalcy is what makes family annihilation cases so disturbing. The behavior that precedes them often blends seamlessly into daily life. There are no obvious alarms, no public breakdowns, no visible violence. What exists instead is an internal reorientation, where the perpetrator's sense of self detaches from their role within the family. Responsibility becomes resentment. Dependence becomes burden. Love becomes obligation. And obligation, once stripped of emotional grounding, can be rationalized away. The Watts case also highlighted the role of narrative control. From the moment Shanann and the children were reported missing, Chris attempted to manage how the situation was perceived. His statements emphasized concern while avoiding specifics. His explanations remained vague. He positioned himself as confused rather than distressed, cooperative rather than desperate. This approach reflects a common tactic in deceptive behavior: keep the story flexible enough to adapt as new information emerges. But flexibility comes at a cost. The more a narrative bends, the more it reveals its artificial nature. When digital evidence contradicted his account, Chris adjusted rather than confronted the contradiction. This pattern of adjustment is significant. Truth tends to remain stable even under pressure. Fabrication requires constant revision. Each revision increases cognitive load, increasing the likelihood of error. Investigators did not rely on intuition alone. They relied on the accumulation of small, verifiable facts that resisted reinterpretation. In this sense, the case demonstrated how modern investigations dismantle deception not through dramatic confrontations, but through patient alignment of data. Public reaction to the Watts case was intense and sustained, partly because it violated deeply held assumptions about fatherhood. Society invests fathers with a symbolic role as protectors and providers. When that symbol collapses, the shock reverberates beyond the immediate crime. The deaths of Bella, and Celeste forced viewers to confront the possibility that parental instinct is not an unbreakable safeguard, but a construct that can fail under certain psychological conditions. This realization is profoundly destabilizing, and it explains why the case continues to provoke strong emotional responses years later. Another reason the story persists is the way it intersects with performance culture. The Watts family life was highly visible online, documented in videos and posts that portrayed enthusiasm, affection, and togetherness. After the murders, those same images were reinterpreted through the lens of tragedy, transforming from evidence of happiness into evidence of concealment. This shift underscores a critical truth about digital life. What is shared publicly is often aspirational rather than descriptive. Social media does not capture private despair. It captures what people want to believe about themselves and their relationships. The contrast between Shanann's visible investment in family identity and Chris's private disengagement deepened the sense of betrayal. She appeared to be fighting for the marriage, attempting to repair emotional distance, while he had already withdrawn. This asymmetry matters. Many violent domestic outcomes are preceded by unequal commitment, where one partner is still trying to preserve the relationship while the other has already abandoned it internally. When that abandonment is paired with entitlement and a desire for control, the risk escalates dramatically. In examining the aftermath, it becomes clear that the Watts case also changed how audiences engage with true crime itself. Viewers became more attentive to patterns rather than sensational details. They learned to notice emotional withdrawal, narrative inconsistency, and the role of digital footprints. The case became a reference point, a framework against which new stories were measured. This educational aspect does not lessen the tragedy, but it does shape how the story functions within the broader cultural conversation. Despite extensive analysis, no explanation fully neutralizes the horror. Understanding motive does not restore life. Context does not excuse action. The ultimate reality of the Watts case is stark and irreversible. A man chose to end the lives of his wife and children rather than confront the consequences of his own decisions. That choice reverberates beyond legal guilt. It challenges how society thinks about responsibility, accountability, and the limits of empathy. The story remains a reminder that danger does not always arrive with warning signs that demand attention. Sometimes it arrives quietly, dressed as routine, hidden behind politeness and familiarity. Sometimes the most devastating acts are preceded not by chaos, but by calm, by a person who has already decided that the future they want requires the elimination of the present they have. And that is why the Watts case continues to be revisited, retold, and examined. Not because it offers comfort or closure, but because it exposes a truth that is difficult to face. That ordinary environments can conceal extraordinary harm. That love can be performed while being privately withdrawn. And that the line between normal life and irreversible violence can be crossed without spectacle, without warning, and without a sound. In the years following the convictions, the Watts case began to occupy a strange space between concluded fact and unresolved meaning. Legally, everything was finished. The verdict was clear. The sentence was final. And yet the case continued to circulate, not because people doubted what happened, but because they struggled to integrate it into a coherent understanding of human behavior. The facts alone were not enough. They explained the sequence, but not the transformation. They documented the outcome, but not the internal process that allowed a father to detach so completely from the lives he had helped create. This unresolved tension is what keeps the story alive. It is not driven by mystery, but by disbelief. One of the most unsettling realizations to emerge from sustained examination of the case is how unremarkable the warning period appeared from the outside. There was no dramatic escalation visible to neighbors or casual acquaintances. No public confrontations. No overt threats. What existed instead was a slow emotional retreat that did not register as dangerous until it was already complete. Chris Watts did not signal violence. He signaled indifference. And indifference, when directed toward people who depend on you for survival, can be just as lethal as rage. The case forces a recognition that emotional abandonment can precede physical destruction, and that the absence of conflict does not equal the presence of safety. The Watts murders also exposed how modern life can unintentionally shield harmful intentions. Structured routines, predictable schedules, and the isolation of suburban living can create environments where private decisions go unobserved. Neighbors may exchange greetings without ever sharing meaningful insight into each other's lives. Families may exist side by side without true intimacy. In this context, a person can unravel internally while appearing outwardly intact. The case demonstrates that isolation is not always geographical. Sometimes it is psychological, occurring within relationships that appear stable on the surface. Another enduring aspect of the case is how it reframed the concept of responsibility. Chris Watts was not overwhelmed by a sudden crisis beyond his control. He was confronted with consequences he did not want to face. Divorce, financial reckoning, social judgment, and the dismantling of a carefully constructed identity all loomed as possible outcomes. Instead of confronting those realities, he chose to eliminate the people who anchored him to them. This choice reflects a deeply distorted sense of entitlement, one in which personal freedom is valued above human life. That mindset is not common, but it is not incomprehensible, and that is what makes it dangerous. The role of shame in the case has also been widely discussed. Shame operates quietly, eroding self-image and amplifying the desire to escape exposure. For Chris Watts, the prospect of being seen as a failure appeared intolerable. The contradiction between the man he wanted to be perceived as and the man his circumstances revealed created an internal pressure that he resolved through annihilation rather than accountability. This does not mitigate guilt. It clarifies the mechanism. Shame, when combined with narcissistic thinking and emotional detachment, can fuel catastrophic decisions. For the families left behind, the case represents a permanent rupture. The loss extends beyond the immediate victims to parents, siblings, and extended relatives who must navigate a world forever divided into before and after. No analysis can restore what was taken. No explanation can fill the absence left by 3 lives erased. The legal conclusion provides structure, but it does not provide healing. The cultural attention surrounding the case often obscures this reality, turning personal devastation into public content. This tension between awareness and exploitation is an ongoing ethical challenge within true crime storytelling. At a societal level, the Watts case continues to influence how people talk about domestic violence and coercive control. It underscores that danger does not always manifest through physical aggression early on. Emotional withdrawal, secrecy, and the silent devaluation of others can be equally significant indicators of risk. The case has encouraged more nuanced conversations about prevention, about recognizing behavioral patterns rather than waiting for overt acts of harm. While no framework can predict every tragedy, awareness can narrow the space in which such decisions remain hidden. The story also serves as a cautionary tale about identity and performance. Chris Watts maintained a version of himself that functioned well enough in public, but collapsed under private scrutiny. This duality is increasingly relevant in a world where curated personas are common and authenticity is optional. The gap between who a person appears to be and who they actually are can widen unnoticed, especially when reinforced by external validation. The Watts case illustrates what can happen when that gap becomes a chasm. Ultimately, the enduring weight of the case lies in its ordinariness. There were no dramatic chase scenes, no criminal networks, no elaborate cover-ups. There was a man, a family, and a series of decisions made in isolation. That simplicity strips away comforting illusions. It suggests that the capacity for extreme harm does not require extreme circumstances. It can emerge from everyday pressures, distorted priorities, and a failure to recognize others as inviolable human beings. The Watts case does not offer redemption or resolution. It offers a stark record of what happens when empathy collapses and self-interest becomes absolute. It remains a reminder that the most catastrophic acts are not always preceded by visible chaos. Sometimes they are preceded by quiet withdrawal, by a person who stops seeing the people around them as lives worth preserving. And when that internal shift goes unnoticed, the consequences can be irreversible. As the narrative surrounding the Watts case matured, it began to shift from shock toward reflection, from the immediate horror of the acts themselves to the quieter, more unsettling implications about human behavior and social structure. The case stopped being only about what Chris Watts did and became a study in how easily the frameworks people rely on to judge safety can fail. Marriage, parenthood, employment, routine, even public affection are often treated as indicators of stability. In this story, those indicators existed right up until the moment they proved meaningless. The realization that such markers can coexist with extreme violence unsettled audiences because it dismantled the idea that danger is always visible, always loud, always recognizable before it strikes. One of the most chilling aspects of the case is how thoroughly the decision to kill appeared to be separated from emotional turbulence. There was no evidence of a sudden psychological break, no explosive argument that spiraled out of control. Instead, the crime reflected a controlled sequence of actions carried out by someone who had already crossed an internal threshold. This distinction matters. Crimes driven by impulse often leave behind chaos and regret. Crimes driven by decision leave behind planning, concealment, and an eerie emotional flatness. In the Watts case, that flatness was evident not only in the aftermath, but in the way Chris interacted with the situation as it unfolded, as though he were managing a problem rather than responding to a catastrophe. The children's presence in the case continues to be the element that defies comprehension. Bella and Celeste were not incidental victims. They were central to the family identity Chris sought to escape. In family annihilation dynamics, children are sometimes viewed by perpetrators not as individuals, but as extensions of the partner, symbols of obligation, or barriers to a new life. This dehumanization does not require overt hatred. It requires emotional erasure. The Watts case illustrates how emotional erasure can occur quietly, without outward cruelty, until the moment it becomes lethal. Another layer of the case that continues to provoke analysis is the contrast between conflict avoidance and conflict resolution. Chris Watts did not confront his dissatisfaction openly. He avoided it. He withdrew. He allowed resentment to accumulate without expression. This pattern is common and usually nonviolent, but in rare cases, it can intersect with entitlement and narcissistic thinking in catastrophic ways. Avoidance delays accountability. It allows fantasy to grow unchecked. When reality finally demands recognition, the individual may perceive it as an existential threat rather than a challenge to be addressed. The role of masculinity and expectation has also been examined in the wake of the case. Chris Watts fit a cultural mold that values stoicism, compliance, and the appearance of reliability. He was described as quiet, agreeable, non-confrontational. These traits are often socially rewarded, but they can also mask an inability to process dissatisfaction in healthy ways. When emotional expression is limited to internal spaces, it can become distorted. The Watts case does not suggest that quiet men are dangerous. It suggests that emotional suppression, when paired with entitlement and a lack of self-reflection, can become volatile under pressure. Over time, the case has also influenced how people interpret early investigative stages in missing person scenarios. The rapid transition from concern to suspicion in the Watts case demonstrated how critical behavioral context is. Investigators did not wait for physical evidence alone. They evaluated plausibility. They assessed routine disruption. They recognized that voluntary disappearance has a behavioral signature, and that signature was absent. This approach has since been referenced as an example of effective early intervention, where attention to pattern prevented prolonged uncertainty. The cultural afterlife of the case has been shaped by documentaries, analyses, and long-form narratives that attempt to reconstruct not just the events, but the internal logic that preceded them. Each retelling serves a dual function. It memorializes the victims, and it interrogates the conditions that allowed the crime to occur. This duality is uncomfortable but necessary. Without examination, the story risks becoming spectacle. With examination, it becomes a cautionary study in moral disengagement and the consequences of unchecked self-interest. At its core, the Watts case confronts a fundamental fear that intimacy does not guarantee safety. People want to believe that proximity breeds protection, that shared life creates mutual accountability. This case shattered that belief. It demonstrated that proximity can also provide opportunity, that shared trust can be exploited, and that familiarity can be weaponized. This is not a comforting conclusion, but it is an honest one, and it explains why the case continues to be discussed with such intensity. The finality of the legal outcome contrasts sharply with the open-ended nature of the questions the case leaves behind. There is no rehabilitative arc to follow, no redemption narrative to explore. Chris Watts will remain defined by his actions, and the victims will remain absent. What persists is the responsibility of the living to understand the warning signs that are not dramatic, to take emotional withdrawal seriously, and to resist the assumption that normal appearance equates to moral safety. In this sense, the Watts case functions less like a closed chapter and more like a reference point, a grim benchmark against which other stories are measured. It reminds us that the most dangerous decisions are sometimes made in silence, by people who look ordinary in places that feel safe. And it leaves us with a final, unsettling truth, that vigilance is not about fear, but about attention, about noticing when empathy fades, when accountability is avoided, and when someone begins to see the people closest to them not as lives to protect, but as obstacles to remove. As attention slowly drifted from the immediacy of the crime to its long-term meaning, the Watts case began to settle into a darker category of collective memory. It became less about shock and more about recognition. Recognition that the conditions which produced the crime were not exotic or rare, but quietly embedded in ordinary life. Recognition that catastrophic violence does not always grow from chaos, but often from order, routine, and emotional disengagement that goes unnoticed, because it looks so much like calm. The case forced an uncomfortable reevaluation of what danger actually looks like when it is not shouting, but withdrawing. One of the most difficult aspects to confront is how convincingly Chris Watts occupied the role expected of him right up until the end. He was present, compliant, and outwardly cooperative. He did not fit the cultural script of an aggressor. He fit the script of a man who avoided conflict, who followed instructions, who rarely pushed back. This outward compliance functioned as camouflage. It created a perception of harmlessness that discouraged deeper scrutiny. In retrospect, that compliance was not rooted in empathy, but in passivity, a willingness to go along until going along no longer served his private goals. The crime also highlighted how personal narratives can override moral boundaries when left unchallenged. Chris Watts constructed an internal story in which he was the central figure entitled to relief, freedom, and reinvention. In that story, the suffering of others became secondary, then irrelevant. This is not a sudden leap. It is a gradual recalibration of values, where inconvenience is reframed as injustice, and responsibility is reframed as oppression. Once this reframing is complete, extreme actions can be rationalized as solutions rather than atrocities. Another enduring theme of the case is the illusion of resolution. Confession and sentencing often create the impression that understanding has been achieved. In reality, they only establish accountability. They do not resolve the deeper questions about prevention, recognition, and human capacity. The Watts case remains unsettling precisely because it offers no satisfying explanation that can be neatly applied to future scenarios. It resists simplification. It refuses to be reduced to a single cause or a single warning sign. Instead, it demands sustained attention to complexity. The broader social response to the case also revealed how deeply people want certainty in the face of domestic violence. Viewers searched for definitive clues, moments that could be isolated and labeled as obvious indicators. But the truth is less reassuring. The most significant warning signs were emotional rather than physical, internal rather than visible. Withdrawal, detachment, secrecy, and the quiet erosion of empathy do not trigger alarms in the same way that shouting or physical aggression does. This mismatch between risk and recognition leaves a dangerous gap. Over time, the Watts case has been used in training, analysis, and discussion as an example of how modern investigations must integrate behavioral context with forensic data. It demonstrated that understanding relationships, routines, and psychological patterns is as critical as collecting physical evidence. The case did not hinge on a single breakthrough moment. It progressed through accumulation, through the steady alignment of inconsistencies with verifiable facts. This methodical approach exposed the fragility of fabricated narratives and reinforced the importance of patience in uncovering truth. The legacy of the case is also inseparable from the lives it ended. Shanann, Bella, and Celeste are often discussed in relation to the crime, but their absence represents more than a case study. It represents futures that were erased, relationships that were severed, and an entire network of human connections that will never fully recover. True crime narratives risk abstracting loss into analysis. The Watts case resists that abstraction because the victims were so vividly present before they were gone. Their normalcy makes the loss harder to compartmentalize. As years pass, the case continues to surface whenever similar patterns appear elsewhere. It has become a reference point, a cautionary comparison invoked when a family disappearance defies easy explanation or when a public persona begins to fracture under scrutiny. This persistence is not driven by fascination alone. It is driven by fear, by the recognition that the conditions that enabled the crime are not confined to one household or one moment in time. Ultimately, the Watts case leaves behind a responsibility rather than a conclusion. A responsibility to take emotional withdrawal seriously. A responsibility to question narratives that rely too heavily on appearances. A responsibility to recognize that accountability avoided can turn destructive when paired with entitlement and self-centered fantasy. The case does not suggest that such outcomes are common. It suggests that they are possible, and that possibility alone demands vigilance. The story remains a stark reminder that the most devastating acts are not always accompanied by visible warning signs. Sometimes they are preceded by silence, by a person who stops engaging, stops caring, and starts imagining a future that excludes the people who trust them most. When that internal shift goes unnoticed or unchallenged, the consequences can be final, irreversible, and incomprehensible. The Watts case ends without comfort, without ambiguity, and without redemption. It concludes not as a mystery solved, but as a warning carved into the fabric of modern domestic life. What happened inside that house was not the product of chaos or madness erupting in a single moment. It was the result of a gradual moral collapse, a slow internal shift in which empathy eroded, responsibility became resented, and human lives were reduced to obstacles standing in the way of a desired future. The crime forces an uncomfortable truth into the open, that normality is not protection, that routine can conceal danger, and that the most catastrophic violence can emerge not from visible hatred, but from quiet indifference. The legacy of this case is not found in court documents or sentences served, but in the uneasy awareness it leaves behind. An awareness that appearances lie. That silence can be more dangerous than conflict. That disengagement, when paired with entitlement, can become lethal. And that vigilance is not about fear, but about attention to the moments when someone stops seeing the people closest to them as lives to be protected and begins to see them as something to be removed.